before time held meaning, before the stars knew their names, before even the concept of existence had taken its first trembling breath, there was nothing. Not the comforting darkness of a moonless night, nor the fertile emptiness that poets might romanticize, but true and absolute nothingness. This was Ginnungagap, the yawning void, the gaping abyss where potential lay dormant and undisturbed, waiting for the first spark that would set creation into motion. Imagine, if you can, a place where even emptiness seems too substantial, a concept. Ginnungagap was not merely the absence of things, it was the space between what was not yet and what could never be. The ancient Norse understood this primordial void as something both terrifying and necessary, the canvas upon which all existence would eventually be painted. In the complete silence of this abyss, there were no gods to witness it, no consciousness to comprehend it, only the vast and terrible potential of what might someday be. Yet even in this absolute nothingness, forces were gathering at the edges of Ginnungagap. To the north lay Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, a world of primordial cold, so profound that it seemed to suck the very concept of warmth from existence. From the heart of Niflheim flowed the Elevagar, ancient rivers of poisonous waters that carried their venom toward the void. Though the exact number varies across the sources, these rivers poured their icy contents into Ginnungagap, where they froze layer upon layer, building mountains of ancient ice that knew nothing of life or warmth. To the south burned Muspelheim, the realm of fire, a world of flames so intense that they existed beyond mere heat, becoming something more fundamental, more primal. This was not the friendly fire of a hearth, or even the destructive flames of a wildfire. This was elemental fire in its purest form, the kind of heat that predates stars and will outlast them, the fire that both creates and consumes with equal passion. Muspelheim blazed with an intensity that needed no fuel, a realm where Surtur, the fire giant, stood eternal watch with his flaming sword that would one day burn the world. For countless ages that had no measure, these two realms remained separate, ice and fire keeping to their own territories, neither aware of the other's existence. But the nature of Ginnungagap was such that nothing could remain static forever. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the realms began to grow. The ice of Niflheim crept southward, building its frozen monuments higher and higher, while the heat of Muspelheim pushed northward, sending waves of warmth into the void. It was inevitable that they would meet, and when they did, the universe as we know it began its journey into being. The meeting of ice and fire in the center of Ginnungagap created something that had never existed before, where the venomous rivers froze into great glaciers and the heat from Muspelheim touched them. The ice began to melt. Drops of water formed, pregnant with possibility, each one containing within it the potential for life. These were not ordinary drops of water. They were the essence of creation itself, the first liquid substance in a universe that had known only solid ice and consuming flame. The drops fell, gathered, and began to take shape, coalescing into something that had consciousness, that had being, that had the terrible gift of existence. From these drops emerged Ymir, the first giant, the ancestor of all that would come after. According to scholars, his name likely derives from an old word meaning the screamer, or possibly twin, though the exact etymology remains debated. What is clear from the sources is that Ymir was enormous beyond comprehension, a hermaphroditic being who contained within his body the seeds of an entire race. He was not good or evil, for those concepts did not yet exist. He simply was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the chaos that preceded order. Ymir's existence was one of primal need. He was hungry in a way that transcended mere physical hunger, possessing an emptiness that demanded to be filled. But there was nothing to consume in this newly forming world until another being emerged from the melting ice. This was Audumla, the primordial cow, whose creation was as mysterious as Ymir's own. She appeared fully formed from the meeting of ice and fire, a creature of nourishment and sustenance in a world that had known neither. From Audumla's udders flowed 4 rivers of milk, rich and endless, and Ymir drank from them to satisfy his terrible hunger. The milk was not like any milk that would later exist in the formed world. It was the milk of creation itself, containing within it the essence of possibility and potential. As Ymir drank, he grew stronger, more substantial, more real, and in his sleep, as he lay satisfied by Audumla's nourishment, strange things began to happen to his body. From the sweat that formed in the pit of his left arm, 2 beings emerged, a male and a female, the first of the frost giants who would populate Jotunheim. These beings came into existence without conscious creation, spawned from Ymir's body as naturally as crystals form in a cave. They looked upon their progenitor with eyes that saw the universe for the first time, and they too possessed the hunger, the drive, the consuming need that characterized all giants. But even stranger things were occurring. One of Ymir's legs became intimate with the other, and from this union came a son with 6 heads, a being of such unusual nature that it defied all later categories of existence. This was the genesis of the giants, these beings born not through any act of will or love, but through the simple fact of Ymir's existence. He was so full of creative potential that his very body generated life without intention, seeding the universe with beings who would one day oppose the gods themselves. While Ymir slept and reproduced, Audumla had her own role to play in creation. She required nourishment just as Ymir did, but there was no grass for her to graze, no plants for her to consume. Instead, she licked the salty ice blocks that surrounded them, drawing sustenance from the ancient minerals trapped within the frozen water. Her warm tongue melted the ice slowly, patiently, revealing something that had been trapped within all along. On the first day of her licking, hair emerged from the ice, golden and fine, glinting in the light of distant Muspelheim. On the second day, a head appeared, noble and strong, with features that suggested something different from the giants. By the third day, an entire man stood free, tall and powerful, blessed with strength and beauty. This was Buri, the first of the Aesir line, and he represented something entirely new in the universe. He was neither giant nor chaos, but something that contained within it the seeds of order, of purpose, of divine potential. Buri wasted no time in establishing his lineage. He fathered a son named Bor, and Bor in turn married Besla, who was a daughter of the giant Bolthorn. This marriage between the descendants of Buri and the giants shows that the lines between order and chaos were not yet firmly drawn. The universe was still new, still finding its shape, and such unions were not only possible but necessary. From the marriage of Bor and Besla came 3 sons who would change everything. Their names were Odin, Vili, and Ve, and they would become the architects of the ordered cosmos, the slayers of chaos, the founders of Asgard, and all that would follow. But that moment had not yet arrived, for now Ymir still lived, growing ever larger, spawning more giants from his sweat and his flesh, creating through his very existence an endless tide of chaotic beings who knew nothing of order or law. The brothers looked upon Ymir and saw not their ancestor but a threat, a being whose continued existence would forever prevent the universe from achieving the structure and order that it required. And so they made a decision that would echo through all of time, a choice so momentous that the universe itself trembled at its implications. They attacked Ymir, these three brothers, and though he was enormous and powerful, though he fought with the strength of primordial chaos itself, they prevailed. The battle was cataclysmic, a struggle that shook the foundations of the emerging cosmos. When Odin, Vili, and Ve finally struck the killing blow, Ymir's blood poured forth in such quantities that it became a flood, a deluge of red that swept across the forming world. Every giant that had emerged from Ymir's body was caught in this flood, drowning in the blood of their progenitor, swept away by the tide of his death. Only two giants survived this catastrophe. Bergelmir, Ymir's grandson, and his unnamed wife managed to escape by climbing onto a luder, which some scholars interpret as a primitive mill or grinding stone, while others believe it to be a hollowed-out log. They rowed this vessel across the sea of blood, watching as their entire race was washed away, until they finally found refuge in what would become Jotunheim. From these two survivors, a new race of giants would eventually emerge, forever bearing the memory of their near extinction and nursing an eternal grudge against the gods who had caused it. The three brothers looked upon Ymir's massive corpse and saw not just a dead giant, but the raw materials for creation. With an ingenuity that would characterize the gods throughout their existence, they dragged the enormous body into the middle of Ginnungagap and began the great work of shaping the cosmos. Every part of Ymir would be used, nothing wasted, his body transformed from an agent of chaos into the very foundation of order. From Ymir's flesh, soft and giving, they shaped the earth itself, the ground beneath our feet, the soil that grows our crops, the land that sustains all terrestrial life. All of this came from the body of the first giant. They spread his flesh across the void, creating continents and islands, hills and valleys, establishing the geography that would define the realm of mortals. This earth was neither fully giant nor fully divine, but something transformed, something that could sustain both chaos and order in careful balance. From Ymir's blood and sweat, the brothers created the seas and lakes, the oceans and rivers that would cover much of the world. This water carried within it the memory of Ymir, the salt tang of his sweat, the iron taste of his blood. It was water that knew death and violence, water that had been part of a living being, and perhaps that is why the sea has always been seen as dangerous, as unpredictable, as something that can sustain life and take it away with equal ease. Ymir's bones, strong and enduring, became the mountains, those ancient peaks that rise toward the sky. Some of these mountains were entire bones, thrust upward to create ranges that stretch for hundreds of miles. Others were fragments, creating lesser peaks and rocky outcroppings. These mountains contained within them the very skeleton of chaos, the structural framework that had supported the first giant. They stood as eternal monuments to Ymir's former existence, reminders that even chaos has its place in creation, The brothers took Ymir's teeth and the bones that had shattered during the battle, and from these they fashioned stones and gravel, scree and pebbles. Every rock you have ever held in your hand, every pebble that has ever crunched beneath your feet, these were once part of Ymir's body. They carry within them the echo of his existence, the memory of when they were living bone rather than lifeless stone. From Ymir's skull, enormous and curved, the brothers created the dome of the sky. They lifted this great vault and placed it over the earth, creating the boundary between the mortal realm and the heavens beyond. But the sky needed to be supported, needed to be held in place lest it fall and crush the newly formed world. So the brothers created 4 dwarves, placing one at each corner of the world. These dwarves were named Nordri, Sudri, Austri, and Vestri, names that simply mean north, south, east, and west, and they bear upon their shoulders the weight of the heavens, holding the sky in place for all eternity. But the sky was dark, devoid of light, save for the distant glow of Muspelheim. The brothers took the sparks and burning embers that flew from that realm of fire and flung them into the air, where they became the stars, countless points of light scattered across the heavens. Each star was a fragment of primordial fire, tamed and placed in a specific location, given a specific path to follow across the night sky. The sun and moon, those great celestial bodies, were also placed in the sky, though their stories were complex and would involve yet more violence and tragedy. From Ymir's brain, they fashioned the clouds, those heavy, lowering masses that would bring rain and snow to the world below. Even the thoughts of the first giant, if he had any, were transformed into something useful, something that would serve the ordered cosmos. The clouds drifted across the sky, casting shadows on the earth below, bringing water from the sea back to the land in an endless cycle of transformation and renewal. Finally, the brothers took Ymir's eyebrows and used them to create a fortification, a wall that would separate the central realm of the earth from the dangerous outer regions where the giants dwelt. This barrier formed a rough circle, and the land within it was called Midgard, meaning middle enclosure or middle earth. This was the realm that would be given to humanity, a protected space where mortals could live without constant threat from the giants and other chaotic forces that roamed the outer darkness. But there were no humans yet to inhabit this carefully prepared realm. The earth was ready, the seas filled their basins, the sky stretched overhead with its countless stars, but the world was empty of mortal life. The brothers walked along the seashore, surveying their creation, when they came upon 2 logs that had washed up on the beach. One was an ash tree, the other an elm, stripped bare by the waves, smooth and weathered. The brothers looked at these pieces of wood and saw potential within them, the possibility of creating beings who could appreciate the world that had been made, who could live and struggle and die, and find meaning in the space between birth and death. Odin, the eldest and wisest of the brothers, approached the logs first and breathed into them the gift of life and spirit, the animating force that separates living beings from mere matter. Vili came next and gave them intelligence and the power of motion, the ability to think and to act upon those thoughts, to move through the world with purpose and intention. Finally, Ve granted them senses, the ability to see and hear and speak, giving them faces and expressions, making them not just alive and mobile, but truly human. The man they called Ask from the ash tree, and the woman they named Embla from the elm. And these first humans stood upon the shore and looked at the world with eyes that had never seen before. They drew breath for the first time and felt the salt air fill their lungs. They heard the crash of waves on the beach and the cry of birds overhead. They were alive, and they were mortal, and they were filled with wonder at the beauty and terror of the cosmos that had been created for them. But the brothers knew that these humans would need more than just life and senses to thrive. They needed a home, a place of safety and shelter. So the gods built a great hall for them within Midgard, teaching them how to construct buildings, how to work metal, how to grow crops and raise animals. The humans learned quickly, their intelligence allowing them to adapt and survive in ways that the chaotic giants never could. They multiplied and spread across Midgard, building villages and towns, creating communities and cultures, becoming the ancestors of all humanity. Meanwhile, the gods were not idle. They had created the world from Ymir's body, given life to humanity, but they themselves needed a home, a seat of power, from which they could govern the cosmos and maintain the order they had established. High above Midgard, in the branches of a great tree that had grown in the space between realms, they built Asgard, the enclosure of the gods, a realm of magnificent halls and golden palaces where the divine could dwell. Yet the creation was not complete, for the cosmos needed structure, needed a framework that would connect all its disparate parts. From the earth below to the heavens above, through realms that existed in the spaces between spaces, there grew a tree unlike any other. This was Yggdrasil, the world tree, the ash tree, whose roots delved deep into the wells of fate, and whose branches stretched into every realm of existence. Yggdrasil was more than just a tree, though it was certainly that, an ash of such immense size that its scale defied comprehension. It was the axis around which the entire cosmos revolved, the connection between all things, the living embodiment of the interconnected nature of existence. Its name, often translated as Odin's horse or the Terrible One's horse, referred to the time when Odin would hang from its branches in his quest for wisdom. Riding the tree as a shaman might ride their spirit animal into other realms of consciousness. The world tree existed in a way that defied normal spatial relationships. It was not simply located in one place, but rather it connected all places, its roots and branches extending through the barriers between worlds. To understand Yggdrasil is to understand that the Norse cosmos was not a simple stack of realms one atop another, but rather a complex web of interconnected spaces, all bound together by the tree's living wood. 3 great roots supported Yggdrasil, each extending into a different realm and drawing sustenance from a different source. The sources offer different accounts of exactly where each route leads, but they agree on the existence of 3 great wells. One route stretched toward the well of Urd, the spring of fate where the Norns dwelt. These 3 sisters, whose names were Urd, past, Verdandi, present, and Skuld, future, controlled the destiny of all beings, gods and mortals alike. Each day they would take water from the well and white clay from its banks and sprinkle it on the tree's roots to preserve it from rot and decay. The water of the well of Urd was so pure that anything touched by it became white as the membrane of an egg. Another route extended to where Mimir's well lay hidden. This well contained the waters of wisdom and memory, and it was guarded by Mimir, a being of immense knowledge and understanding. The water of this well held all the wisdom of the past, all knowledge of things that were and things that might be. Odin himself would one day sacrifice his eye to drink from this well, trading physical sight for the deeper sight of wisdom and understanding. The third root reached the spring called Hvergelmir, the roaring cauldron located in Niflheim. This was the source from which all rivers flowed, the wellspring of waters both pure and poisonous. Here dwelt Nidhogg, the dragon whose name means the dread biter. And this serpent gnawed constantly at the root, working to destroy the tree and bring about the collapse of cosmic order. Around Nidhogg writhed countless other serpents, all feeding on the root, all working toward the tree's eventual destruction. Within and upon Yggdrasil lived many creatures, each playing their role in the great drama of existence. At the very top of the tree, on the highest branch that stretched toward the heavens, perched an eagle whose name was never given but who was said to possess great wisdom. Between this eagle's eyes sat a hawk named Vedrfolnir, who observed all that occurred in the 9 worlds and reported what he saw to the eagle. Far below at the roots where Nidhogg gnawed, the dragon seethed with hatred for the eagle above. The two creatures despised each other with a passion that had no origin and would have no end. To carry insults between them ran Ratatoskr, the squirrel, who scurried up and down the trunk of Yggdrasil, bearing messages of hate and scorn. Ratatoskr loved nothing more than to stir up trouble, to inflame the conflict between eagle and dragon, to fan the flames of their mutual hatred. In this way, the squirrel represented the forces of discord that existed even within the ordered cosmos. 4 stags grazed on the branches of Yggdrasil, their names Dane, Dvalin, Dunir, and Durathror, and they fed on the tree's leaves and tender shoots. Like Nidhogg below, these stags contributed to the ongoing damage that Yggdrasil sustained, nibbling away at its substance, weakening it bit by bit. Yet the tree endured, sustained by the care of the Norns, regenerating as quickly as it was consumed, maintaining its structural integrity through the constant cycle of damage and renewal. Around this great tree were arrayed the 9 worlds, each distinct in character and purpose, yet all connected by the tree's roots and branches. These realms existed in a complex relationship, sometimes stacked one above another, sometimes existing side by side in ways that defied simple spatial understanding. To travel between them required either divine power, knowledge of secret paths, or the ability to walk the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, which connected Asgard to Midgard and was guarded by the ever-vigilant god Heimdall. At the highest point of this cosmic structure sat Asgard, the realm of the Aesir, the gods who ruled over the cosmos. This was no simple dwelling, but a magnificent complex of halls and palaces, each built for a specific deity, each reflecting the character and power of its owner. The walls of Asgard were strong, built by a giant mason whose story would involve trickery and tragedy, and within these walls the gods held their councils, feasted in their halls, and prepared for the battles that they knew must come. The greatest of Asgard's halls was Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, which belonged to Odin himself. This enormous building had 540 doors, each wide enough for 800 warriors to march through simultaneously. Its rafters were made of spears, its roof thatched with golden shields, and the benches within were strewn with mail coats. Here gathered the Einherjar, the chosen slain, warriors who had died bravely in battle and been selected by the Valkyries to join Odin's army. Each day these warriors would arm themselves and fight in the courtyard until all were slain. Then each evening they would rise again, their wounds healed, to feast on the meat of the boar Sehrimnir and drink mead that flowed from the goat Hydrun. Odin also possessed another hall, Gladsheim, which served as his council chamber. Here stood his high seat, Hlidskjalf, from which the All-Father could observe all 9 worlds. This throne granted Odin the ability to see everything that occurred throughout the cosmos, to watch the deeds of gods, giants, and mortals, to observe the slow unfolding of fate. This was both a gift and a burden, for Odin could see threats forming, could watch disasters approach. Yet the nature of fate was such that even foreknowledge could not always prevent what must be. Thor, the thunder god and protector of both gods and mortals, had his hall called Bilskirnir in the realm of Thrudheim. This was the largest building in Asgard, with 540 rooms, and it served as both a home and a fortress. Thor's wife, Sif, dwelt here along with their children, and the hall echoed with the thunder god's booming voice and hearty laughter. In the courtyard stood Thor's goats, Tengrisnir and Tengjoster, who pulled his chariot across the sky, creating thunder with their hooves. Balder, the god of light and purity, had his hall Breidablik, which was known as the most beautiful place in all of Asgard. Its roof was made of silver and its pillars of gold, and nothing impure could enter its doors. This hall stood as a sanctuary of peace and beauty, a place where harmony reigned supreme. Balder's wife Nanna dwelt here with him, and visitors spoke of the profound sense of tranquility that pervaded every corner of the building. Freya, the goddess of love and magic, had her hall Sessrumnir in the field of Folkvangr. This hall received half of all warriors slain in battle, the other half going to Valhalla. The warriors who came to Sessrumnir were no less brave than those who went to Odin. They simply belonged to Freya by right of her status as a goddess of war as well as love. In her hall, these warriors feasted and prepared for Ragnarok, just as the Einherjar did in Valhalla. Below Asgard, connected to it by the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, lay Midgard, the realm of humans. This was the earth itself, the world that had been created from Ymir's body, the place where mortals lived their brief lives and struggled against the hardships of existence. Midgard was surrounded by the ocean, and in the depths of that ocean lived Jormungandr, the world serpent, one of Loki's monstrous children who had grown so large that he encircled the entire realm and grasped his own tail in his mouth. Midgard was characterized by its changeability, its seasons, its cycles of growth and decay. Unlike the eternal realms of the gods or giants, Midgard knew time's passage in a visceral way. Spring brought new life, summer brought growth, autumn brought harvest, and winter brought death. This cycle was both the blessing and curse of mortality, for humans knew that their time was limited, that they must achieve what they could in the brief span allotted to them. The humans of Midgard organized themselves into communities, building towns and cities, creating systems of law and governance. They worshipped the gods, built temples in their honor, made sacrifices to earn their favor. The relationship between gods and mortals was complex, characterized by a combination of reverence, fear, and practical exchange. Humans needed the gods' protection and blessing, while the gods needed human worship and sacrifice to maintain their power. To the east of Midgard lay Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, a land of mountains and wilderness, of forests so thick that sunlight never reached the ground, of peaks so high that their summits were lost in clouds. This was a realm of raw nature, untamed and dangerous, where the rules that governed Asgard and Midgard held no sway. The giants who dwelt here were beings of enormous size and power, representing the forces of chaos and nature that the gods had not fully conquered. Jotunheim was not simply the home of mindless monsters, however. The giants possessed their own culture, their own magic, their own wisdom. Indeed, some of the wisest beings in all the cosmos were giants. Mimir, whose well held the waters of wisdom, was a giant. Many of the gods themselves had giant blood in their ancestry. Odin's mother was a giantess, and Thor was the son of the earth goddess Jord, herself a giantess. The relationship between gods and giants was complex, characterized as much by intermarriage and alliance as by warfare and opposition. The giants built their own strongholds in Jotunheim, fortresses of stone and ice that rivaled Asgard in their impressiveness. The greatest of these was Utgard, the outward enclosure, ruled by the giant king Utgard Loki. This fortress was built on such an enormous scale that even the gods felt small within its walls. Here the giant king would trick Thor and his companions with illusions and magic, demonstrating that the giants' power came not just from their size and strength, but from their cunning and their mastery of ancient sorceries. To the north of Jotunheim, in the coldest reaches of the cosmos, lay the ancient realm of Niflheim, the land of ice and mist that had existed even before the creation of the ordered world. This realm of primordial cold was characterized by its darkness, its endless winter, its inhospitality to life. Yet life did exist here in twisted and terrible forms. Niflheim was a place of endings, of things dying and rotting, of cold so intense that it transcended mere physical sensation to become a metaphysical force. Within Niflheim lay Helheim, the realm of the dead, ruled by Hel, another of Loki's monstrous children. Hel was a being divided, half living flesh and half decaying corpse, her appearance a perfect reflection of her dominion over the boundary between life and death. Her hall, Eljudnir, stood within Niflheim, surrounded by high walls and strong gates. And here came all those who died of sickness, old age, or accident. The realm was not a place of punishment, but neither was it pleasant. The dead who dwelt there lived diminished existences, shadows of their former selves, neither truly alive nor completely gone. To the south, opposite Niflheim, burned Muspelheim, the ancient realm of fire that had existed from the beginning. This land of flames was ruled by Surtur, the fire giant, who stood eternal watch with his flaming sword, waiting for Ragnarok, when he would march north to set the world ablaze. Muspelheim was too hot for anyone but fire giants to survive, a realm where rock ran like water and the air itself seemed to burn. Yet it was a place of terrible beauty, of flames that danced in colors mortal eyes had never seen, of heat so intense that it transcended destruction to become a creative force. The fire giants who dwelt in Muspelheim were fewer in number than the frost giants of Jotunheim, but they were no less dangerous. They served Surtur with absolute loyalty, preparing for the day when they would ride forth to battle the gods. Their role in the cosmos was as agents of destruction, but not meaningless destruction. They would burn away the corruption of the old world, clearing the way for something new to grow from the ashes. Vanaheim was the home of the Vanir, another tribe of gods who were concerned with fertility, prosperity, and the natural world. Less is known about this realm than about many others, for the Vanir were more secretive than the Aesir, their worship more tied to the earth and to the cycles of nature. What is known suggests that Vanaheim was a place of great beauty, of fields that never failed, of abundant harvests and thriving livestock. The Vanir possessed magic that the Aesir did not, particularly the practice of cider, a form of sorcery that involved prophecy and shape-shifting. Alfheim was the realm of the light elves, beings of grace and beauty, who were associated with the sun and with growing things. The light elves were said to be fairer than the sun itself, their beauty so profound that it caused pain to look upon them directly. They served the gods, particularly Freya, to whom Alfheim was given as a gift, and they had the power to bless or curse human endeavors, to bring prosperity or blight to crops, to inspire or confuse mortal minds. Below the earth lay Svartalfheim, also called Nidavellir, the realm of the dark elves and dwarves. These master craftsmen dwelt in great halls carved from living rock, their forges illuminated by the glow of volcanic fires. It was the dwarves who created many of the gods' greatest treasures: Thor's hammer Mjolnir, Odin's spear Gungnir, Freyr's ship Skidbladnir, and many other wondrous items. The dwarves possessed knowledge of metals and stones that surpassed all others, and they could create objects with magical properties that defied natural law. The dwarves were originally maggots that fed on Ymir's flesh after his death, but the gods granted them consciousness and the shape of men. They remained tied to the earth and stone, however, unable to endure sunlight, which would turn them back to stone. They were known for their greed, their skill, and their tendency to drive hard bargains with anyone who sought their services. Many of the gods' treasures were won only through trickery or at great cost, for the dwarves demanded payment that reflected the true value of their incomparable work. These 9 realms together formed the Norse cosmos, all connected by Yggdrasil, all existing in a complex web of relationships and oppositions. The gods in Asgard worked to maintain order, to keep the giants at bay, to ensure that the cycles of nature continued as they should. The giants in Jotunheim represented the forces of chaos and nature that could never be fully tamed. Humans in Midgard lived their brief lives caught between these cosmic forces, trying to carve out space for meaning and purpose in a universe that often seemed hostile to their existence. The gods who ruled from Asgard were themselves divided into 2 groups, the Aesir and the Vanir, who had once been enemies but were now united. The Aesir were the warrior gods, concerned with battle and governance, with maintaining cosmic order through strength and will. The Vanir were the gods of fertility and prosperity, concerned with the natural world and with magic. These 2 groups had fought a terrible war in the distant past, a conflict that ended only when they exchanged hostages and agreed to live in peace. At the head of the Aesir stood Odin, the All-Father, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war. Odin was a complex deity driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge. He had sacrificed his right eye to drink from Mimir's well, trading physical sight for the deeper sight of wisdom. He had hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, enduring terrible suffering to learn the secrets of the runes. Odin was served by two ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names meant thought and memory. Each day these birds would fly across all 9 worlds, observing everything that occurred, then return in the evening to perch on Odin's shoulders and whisper in his ears all that they had seen. Through his ravens, Odin knew everything that happened throughout the cosmos, giving him knowledge that no other being possessed. The All-Father also rode an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, the fastest steed in all the worlds. This horse was one of Loki's children, born when the trickster god transformed himself into a mare to distract a giant stallion. Sleipnir could travel between the realms of the living and the dead, could race across the sky and through the depths of the ocean, could carry his rider anywhere in the cosmos with speed that defied comprehension. Odin presided over Valhalla, where he gathered the Einherjar, the chosen slain, to form an army that would fight for the gods at Ragnarok. The Valkyries, warrior maidens who served Odin, would ride across battlefields to select the bravest warriors, those who died with courage and honor. These chosen dead would be carried to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until the final battle came. Odin knew through his gift of prophecy that Ragnarok was inevitable, that the gods would fall and the world would be destroyed. Yet he prepared for this battle anyway, gathering his forces, forging his strategies, determined to meet fate with open eyes rather than cower before what could not be changed. Thor, Odin's son, was the thunder god, the protector of both gods and mortals. Where Odin was subtle and complex, Thor was straightforward and direct. He was immensely strong, the strongest of all the gods, and he wielded the hammer Mjolnir, which could level mountains and never missed its target. Thor's primary role was to defend Asgard and Midgard from the giants, and he carried out this duty with enthusiasm, constantly traveling to Jotunheim to battle the enemies of order. Thor was beloved by common people in a way that Odin was not. While Odin was the god of kings and warriors, of poets and sorcerers, Thor was the god of farmers and craftsmen, of ordinary people who needed protection from forces beyond their control. Thor controlled the weather, bringing the thunder and lightning that signaled rain, ensuring that crops would grow and harvests would be plentiful. His hammer Mjolnir was also used to consecrate marriages, to bless newborn children, to sanctify important oaths, demonstrating that his power was not solely destructive. Thor traveled in a chariot drawn by 2 goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjoster. These magical goats could be slaughtered and eaten in the evening, then brought back to life the next morning when Thor touched their bones with his hammer, provided that none of the bones had been broken. This demonstrated Thor's power over life and death, his ability to resurrect and renew, though this power had its limitations and could not save him from his own prophesied death at Ragnarok. Balder was Odin's son and Thor's brother, and he was beloved above all other gods. His beauty was so great that light seemed to shine from him, his character so pure that all who knew him spoke only good of him. Balder embodied the best qualities that the gods possessed: courage without arrogance, strength without cruelty, wisdom without deception. His hall Breidablik was a place of peace, and it was said that no lie could be spoken within its walls. Yet Balder was troubled by dreams, dark visions of his own death that came to him night after night. These dreams disturbed all the gods, for they knew that Balder's death would be a catastrophe, a sign that the cosmic order was beginning to unravel. His mother Frigg, Odin's wife and the goddess of motherhood and prophecy, decided to take action to protect her beloved son. Frigg traveled throughout all the 9 worlds, extracting oaths from everything in existence not to harm Balder. Fire swore it would not burn him. Water swore it would not drown him. Metals swore they would not cut him. Stones swore they would not bruise him. Diseases swore they would not sicken him. Animals swore they would not bite him. Everything in creation made this oath, and when Frigg returned to Asgard, she believed her son was now safe from all harm. The gods celebrated this protection in a way that seems strange to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense in the context of Norse culture. They made a game of throwing weapons at Balder, shooting arrows at him, striking him with swords, hurling stones at his head. Nothing could harm him. Every weapon bounced off, every stone fell harmlessly away, every arrow turned aside before striking. Balder would stand in the center of their gathering, smiling, while the gods tested his invulnerability again and again. But Loki, the trickster god, was displeased by this game. Loki was a complex figure, a god who was counted among the Aesir despite his giant heritage, a being who helped the gods as often as he harmed them. His nature was fundamentally opposed to the kind of absolute protection that Balder enjoyed. Loki believed in change, in transformation, in the necessity of death and destruction to make way for new things. Or perhaps he simply envied the love that all beings showed for Balder, a love that was never fully extended to the trickster himself. Loki disguised himself as an old woman and approached Frigg, engaging her in conversation. Through careful questioning, he learned that there was one thing that had not sworn the oath: mistletoe, a small parasitic plant that Frigg had judged too young and insignificant to bother with. Armed with this knowledge, Loki went and found a branch of mistletoe. He shaped it into a dart, then returned to where the gods were playing their game with Balder. Standing outside the circle of gods was Hod, Balder's brother who was blind. Hod could not participate in the game because he could not see where Balder stood, and he had no weapon to throw in any case. Loki approached Hod and offered to help him honor his brother by guiding his hand. He placed the mistletoe dart in Hod's hand and directed his aim toward Balder. Hod, trusting and innocent, threw the dart. The mistletoe struck Balder in the chest and pierced his heart. The beloved god fell dead without a sound, and for a moment the gods were frozen in shock and horror. Then the reality of what had occurred swept over them, and they began to wail and lament, their grief so profound that it seemed to shake the foundations of Asgard itself. They knew that this death was not just the loss of one god, no matter how beloved. Balder's death was the first sign of Ragnarok, the beginning of the end of their world. The gods held a funeral for Balder that was worthy of his status. His body was placed on his ship Ringhorn, the largest ship ever built, along with his possessions and the things he would need in the afterlife. His wife Nanna, overcome with grief, died of a broken heart and was placed beside him. The ship was to be pushed out to sea and set ablaze, creating a funeral pyre visible across all the 9 worlds. But the ship was so large that no one could move it. Finally, the gods called for a giantess named Hyrrokin, who came riding on a wolf with serpents for reins. She pushed the ship with such force that flames burst from the rollers and the earth trembled. Thor, in his grief and rage, nearly struck her with his hammer for her rough treatment of his brother's beer, but the other gods restrained him. Odin placed his magic ring, Draupnir, on the pyre before it was lit. This ring had the property of producing 8 new rings of equal weight every 9th night, and it was one of Odin's most precious possessions. Its placement on the pyre demonstrated the depth of his grief, the sacrifice he was willing to make to honor his fallen son. The gods lit the pyre, and the flames consumed the ship, carrying Balder and Nanna to the afterlife. But this was not the end, for the gods were not willing to accept Balder's death as final. They decided to send someone to Helheim to negotiate with Hel for Balder's return. The volunteer for this dangerous mission was Hermod, called Hermod the Bold, one of Odin's sons. Hermod rode Sleipnir, for only Odin's horse was swift enough and capable enough to make the journey to the realm of the dead. For 9 days and nights he rode through dark valleys, across bridges that spanned bottomless chasms, past guardians and obstacles that would have turned back any ordinary rider. Finally, he arrived at the gates of Helheim, where Sleipnir leaped over the wall in a single bound, carrying Hermod into the realm of death itself. Hermod found Balder in Hel's hall, seated in the place of honor, for even in death the beloved god received respect. Hermod pleaded with Hel to release Balder, explaining how all the worlds mourned his passing, how the gods and mortals alike wept for his loss. Hel listened to this plea, with her half-dead face, considering the request with the cold calculation that characterized her rule. Finally, Hel agreed to a condition. She would release Balder if every single thing in creation wept for him. If even one being refused to shed tears for the fallen god, then he would remain in Helheim forever. Hermod carried this message back to Asgard, and the gods immediately set about ensuring that all things would weep. They sent messengers throughout all the 9 worlds to every being that existed, asking them to weep for Balder. And everywhere the messengers went, they found willingness to grant this request. Humans wept, gods wept, giants wept, animals wept, even stones and trees wept, shedding moisture in their own way. Everything in creation mourned the death of the beloved god, demonstrating the universal love that Balder had inspired. But in a cave far from anywhere, the messengers found a giantess named Thok. When they asked her to weep for Balder, she refused. Thok will weep dry tears for Balder's death, she said coldly. I got no good from him, living or dead. Let Hel keep what she has. And with that refusal, Balder's fate was sealed. He would remain in Helheim until after Ragnarok, when he would return to rule the new world that would grow from the ashes of the old. The sources don't explicitly identify Thok, but given Loki's role in orchestrating Balder's death, many have suspected that the giantess was actually the trickster in disguise, ensuring that his scheme would not be undone. Whether this suspicion holds truth or not, Loki's role in Balder's death could not be hidden. The gods soon discovered his treachery, and their patience with the trickster finally reached its end. Loki fled from Asgard, knowing that the gods' wrath would be terrible. He built himself a house on a mountain, with doors facing all 4 directions so he could always see anyone approaching. He would spend his days disguised as a salmon, swimming in a nearby waterfall, thinking himself safe from the gods' vengeance. But one day, while sitting in his house, he looked at his fire and considered how the gods might try to catch him. He took some linen and knotted it in the pattern that a net might take, creating the first fishing net. Then he saw the gods approaching and quickly threw the net into the fire before transforming into a salmon and fleeing to the waterfall. But Kvasir, the wisest of the gods, saw the ashes of the net in the fire and understood what Loki had created. The gods made a net following the pattern they found in the ashes and used it to drag the waterfall. Loki, in his salmon form, tried to escape by leaping over the net, but Thor caught him in midair, and the trickster could not escape the thunder god's grip. The gods' punishment for Loki was terrible and designed to last until Ragnarok. They took Loki to a cave and brought his sons Narfi and Vali to witness his punishment. They transformed Vali into a wolf, and in his new form, he tore his brother Narfi apart. The gods took Narfi's entrails and used them to bind Loki to 3 sharp rocks, binding him so tightly that he could not escape. Then they placed a venomous serpent above his head, positioned so that its poison would drip onto Loki's face. Loki's wife Sigyn, who had remained faithful to him despite his crimes, took a bowl and sat beside him, catching the venom before it could reach her husband's face. But periodically, she had to turn away to empty the bowl, and during those moments, the poison would fall on Loki, causing him to writhe in such agony that his convulsions shook the earth. This, the Norse believed, was the cause of earthquakes, the bound god struggling against his chains, and the burning poison. And there, Loki would remain, bound and suffering, his wife faithfully catching the poison year after year, century after century, until the day when his bonds would break and Ragnarok would begin. His punishment was not meant to reform him or to teach him a lesson, for the gods knew he was beyond such redemption. It was simply meant to keep him restrained, to prevent him from causing more harm, to delay for as long as possible the day when he would lead the forces of chaos against the gods themselves. With Balder dead and Loki bound, the golden age of the gods began to fade. The signs of Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, began to appear with increasing frequency. The seers and prophets spoke of what was coming, of the great winter that would herald the end, of the battles that would destroy the gods and remake the world. The prophecies had been known for a long time, spoken in the Voluspa, the vision of the seeress, and repeated by every person who had the gift of foresight. The gods knew what was coming, knew that they could not prevent it, yet they prepared for battle anyway, determined to meet their fate with courage and honor. The first and most terrible sign of Ragnarok would be the Fimbul winter, the great winter that would last for 3 full years, without respite. This would not be an ordinary winter, cold and harsh, but ultimately passing. This would be a winter of supernatural intensity, so cold that the very air seemed to freeze, so dark that the sun's light barely reached the earth, so long that all hope of spring's return would fade from memory. During the Fimbul winter, snow would fall continuously from skies the color of old iron. The sun, already weakened by the wolves, Skoll and Hati, who had chased it across the sky since the world's beginning, would finally be caught and devoured, plunging the world into darkness broken only by the dim glow of the stars. The moon, too, would fall prey to its pursuing wolf, and with the loss of these celestial bodies, time itself would lose its meaning. Days and nights would blur together into one endless twilight of cold and darkness. The crops would fail entirely, first in the first year of the Fimbul winter, then again in the second, then again in the third. The grain would freeze in the ground before it could sprout. The fruit trees would stand barren and dead. The livestock would die in massive numbers, despite every effort to shelter them. The rivers and lakes would freeze solid, so thick that nothing could break through the ice. The seas would become choked with floating ice, making travel by ship impossible, cutting off communities from one another, leaving each settlement to face the winter alone. As the food supplies dwindled and then disappeared entirely, humans would begin to turn on one another. The social bonds that had held communities together would fray and snap under the pressure of starvation. Family members would fight over scraps of food. Neighbors would steal from each other. The weak would be left to die so that the strong might have a slightly better chance of survival. The old laws and customs that had governed human behavior would be forgotten or deliberately ignored as the struggle for survival became all-consuming. Brothers would kill brothers and father would kill son. The most sacred bonds of kinship would be shattered by the desperate need to survive. Sons would murder their fathers to claim their resources. Fathers would abandon their children to conserve food for themselves. The prophecy spoke of an age of axes, an age of swords, an age of broken shields, a wind age, a wolf age before the world's destruction. It would be a time when no one would spare anyone, when mercy would be seen as weakness, when cruelty would be the only rational response to impossible circumstances. All moral structures would collapse. Oaths would be broken without a second thought. For what did honor matter when one was starving? Hospitality, that sacred duty in Norse culture, would be forgotten, as no one would willingly share what little they had with strangers. Incest would become common, that most terrible of taboos, violated as family structures collapsed, and people ceased to care about such niceties. The age of broken kinship would see all social order dissolve into chaos and violence. Beyond the moral decay, cosmic signs would appear to herald the coming of the final battle. The stars would begin to fall from the sky, those points of light that had been placed there at the world's creation, knocked loose by the shaking of Yggdrasil itself. The world tree would tremble, its leaves falling, its branches shaking, as Nidhogg gnawed more fiercely at its roots, and the four stags consumed its foliage with increasing appetite. The foundations of the cosmos would begin to crack, and everyone would know that the end had come. The greatest chain that bound the most terrible threats would begin to weaken. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf, had been bound by the magical chain Gleipnir since he was young, tricked into allowing the gods to place it on him. This chain, made by the dwarves from impossible things, the sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird, had held Fenrir secure for ages beyond counting. But as Ragnarok approached, even this magical chain would begin to weaken under the constant strain of containing the wolf's enormous strength. Fenrir would feel the bonds loosening and would redouble his efforts to break free. His enormous jaws would work against the sword that had been thrust through them to hold them open, placed there by the gods to keep him from biting after Tyr sacrificed his hand to bind the wolf. Fenrir had grown enormously since his binding, had grown so large that when he finally broke free and opened his jaws, his lower jaw would scrape the earth while his upper jaw touched the sky. His howl of triumph and rage would echo across all the 9 worlds, a sound of such terrible fury that it would freeze the blood of all who heard it. Jormungandr, the world's serpent, would also break free from his place in the ocean depths. The great serpent had grown so large that he encircled all of Midgard, grasping his own tail in his mouth. But now he would release his tail and thrash his way toward the shore, creating tidal waves so enormous that they would swallow entire coastlines, drowning cities and villages, sweeping inland to devastate everything in their path. The serpent's poison would spew forth from his mouth, contaminating the waters, filling the air with toxic fumes, making the very atmosphere deadly to breathe. And Loki, too, would break free from his bonds. The earthquakes caused by his suffering would finally shake loose the rocks to which he was bound, and Narfi's entrails, which had been transformed into iron chains, would snap. Loki would emerge from his cave, his face scarred by the serpent's venom, his eyes burning with hatred for the gods who had imprisoned him. He would call to his children, and Fenrir and Jormungandr would answer, joining their father in the assault on the cosmic order that had sought to contain them. Hell would open the gates of Helheim, and the dead would pour forth in a terrible army. These were not the heroic dead who dwelt in Valhalla or Sessrumnir, but the masses of those who had died inglorious deaths, along with the corpses of the oath-breakers and murderers who had been sent to the worst parts of Hell's realm. They would march under Loki's command, a host of the dead so vast that their numbers would darken the earth. The giants, too, would answer the call to battle. From Jotunheim they would march, led by their greatest warriors, their ancient grudge against the gods finally given the opportunity for satisfaction. The frost giants would freeze the ground beneath their feet as they marched, while the fire giants would burn everything in their path. At their head would ride Hrym, the ancient giant who had waited ages for this moment. From Muspelheim, Surtur would lead the sons of Muspel across Bifrost. These fire giants, who had been preparing for this battle since the beginning of time, would cross the Rainbow Bridge with such weight and such heat that the bridge would crack and crumble behind them. The bridge's destruction would sever the connection between Asgard and the other realms, but by then it would be too late. The invasion would have already begun. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, would see all these forces gathering. From his position guarding Bifrost, he would witness the assembly of the armies of chaos, would see Fenrir breaking his chains, Jormungandr rising from the depths, Loki leading the dead from Helheim, the giants marching from Jotunheim, Surtur's fire giants crossing the Rainbow Bridge, and Heimdall would raise the Gjallarhorn, the great horn that he had kept silent for all the ages of the world, and blow it with all his might. The sound of the Gjallarhorn would echo through all 9 worlds, a clarion call that could not be ignored. Its note would pierce through the howling of the Fimbulwinter's winds, would carry across the vast distances that separated the realms, would wake even those who slept the deepest sleep. In Valhalla, the Einherjar would hear it and know that the moment they had been preparing for had finally arrived. They would arm themselves and march forth from the hall, 800 warriors streaming through each of Valhalla's 540 doors, ready at last to face their destiny. The gods themselves would arm for war. Odin would don his golden helmet and his finest armor would take up his spear, Gungnir, and Mount Sleipnir for the ride to the battlefield. Thor would wear his belt of strength and his iron gloves, would grasp Mjolnir in his hand and call his goats to pull his chariot. Tyr, Freyr, Heimdall, all the gods who were capable of battle would prepare themselves, knowing that this would be their final fight, knowing that the prophecies foretold their deaths, yet determined to meet that fate with honor. Odin, in his wisdom, would make one final attempt to gain knowledge that might change the outcome. He would ride Sleipnir down to the well of Mimir and consult with the severed head of his ancient advisor. The head would speak prophecies, would confirm what Odin already knew, that the gods would fall, that the world would burn, that the age of the Aesir was ending. But perhaps there was some comfort in the certainty, in knowing exactly what would happen rather than facing the unknown. The armies would gather on the plain of Vigrid, an enormous field that stretched 100 miles in every direction. This would be the site of the final battle, the place where gods and giants, monsters and heroes, the living and the dead would meet in combat that would determine the fate of the cosmos. The forces of chaos would array themselves on one side, while the gods and their allies would gather on the other. And for a moment before the battle began, they would simply look at each other across that vast field, enemies who had been destined to meet in this place since the beginning of time. Then Heimdall would sound the Gjallarhorn once more, and the battle would begin. The armies would rush toward each other, and the clash when they met would shake the foundations of the earth. This was no ordinary battle, no mere conflict between human armies. This was cosmic war, the final confrontation between order and chaos, the last desperate struggle of the gods to preserve the world they had created. Odin would ride straight for Fenrir, determined to face the monster that he knew would kill him. The All-Father would fight with all his wisdom and skill, would hurl Gungnir with unerring aim, would command the Einherjar with the tactical brilliance that he had developed over countless ages. But Fenrir was not a foe that could be defeated by ordinary means. The wolf's jaws would open wide, so wide that his lower jaw scraped the earth while his upper jaw touched the sky, and Odin would be swallowed whole, the All-Father disappearing down the wolf's throat. But Odin's death would not go unavenged. His son Vidar, called Vidar the Silent, would see his father swallowed by the wolf and would immediately rush forward. Vidar wore a special shoe, thick and heavy, made from the scraps of leather that shoemakers cut away from the toes and heels of shoes. Throughout all the ages of the world, he would place his foot on Fenrir's lower jaw, would grasp the upper jaw with his hands, and with his enormous strength would tear the wolf's jaws apart, killing the beast that had killed his father. Thor would face Jormungandr, the enemy he had encountered twice before in his journeys to Jotunheim. The thunder god and the serpent were ancient adversaries, and now they would meet for the final time. Thor would stride forward, swinging Mjolnir with all his might, and the hammer would strike the serpent's head with a sound like the breaking of mountains. The blow would shatter Jormungandr's skull, would kill the world serpent, would achieve the victory that Thor had long sought. But even in death, the serpent would have its revenge. As Jormungandr died, it would spew forth all its venom in one final, terrible exhalation. The poison would wash over Thor, would fill his lungs, and burn his skin. The thunder god would stagger back, would take 9 steps away from the serpent's corpse, and then would fall dead, killed by the venom of the monster he had slain. Thor and Jormungandr would die within moments of each other, 2 ancient enemies finally ending their long conflict in mutual destruction. Tyr would find himself facing Garm, the monstrous hound that guarded the gates of Helheim. This beast, whose howling could be heard across the worlds, would have broken free from its chains to join in the final battle. Tyr and Garm would fight with savage intensity, the god's skill with weapons, matched against the hound's ferocity and strength. They would wound each other grievously, would continue fighting even as their blood poured out on the ground, and finally, they would strike simultaneous mortal blows, each killing the other at the same instant. Heimdall and Loki, those ancient enemies, would seek each other out amid the chaos of the battlefield. The watchman of the gods and the trickster who had brought about Baldur's death, these two would finally settle their long-standing enmity. They would fight with all the skill and fury they possessed, would wound and wound again, would push each other to the limits of endurance. And in the end, they too would kill each other, Heimdall's sword finding Loki's heart at the same instant that Loki's blade pierced Heimdall's chest. Freyr would face Surtur, the fire giant who had waited since the beginning of time for this moment. Freyr had given away his magical sword long ago, had traded it for the hand of the giantess Gerd in marriage, and now he would face Surtur unarmed. The god would fight bravely, using a stag's antler as an improvised weapon, but without his sword, he stood no chance against Surtur's flaming blade. The fire giant would cut down the god of fertility and sunshine, would kill him, and step over his body to continue his march. For Surtur had a specific purpose in this battle. He had not come merely to kill gods, but to destroy the world itself. As the battle raged, as the gods fell one by one, Surtur would lift his flaming sword high and swing it in a great arc. The sword's flame would spread from its blade, would grow and expand until it covered the sky, until fire rained down on all the 9 worlds. Asgard would burn, and Valhalla would be consumed by flames. Midgard would burn, the forests and fields, the cities and villages, everything that humans had built reduced to ashes. Even Jotunheim and the other realms would feel the heat of Surtur's fire. The stars would fall from the sky as the flames consumed them. Those points of light that had been placed there at the world's creation tumbling down to earth like burning rain. Yggdrasil itself, the great world tree that held together the cosmos, would catch fire, its ancient wood burning, its leaves turning to ash, its roots charring in the earth. The tree that had survived so much, that had endured Nidhogg's gnawing and the stag's browsing, would finally succumb to the flames of Surtur's sword. The earth itself would begin to sink into the sea. The mountains would crumble, the valleys would collapse, and the seas would rise to swallow the land. The water would boil from the heat of the fires above, creating vast clouds of steam that would obscure everything. In this steam and smoke and flame, the last remnants of the world would disappear, would sink beneath the waves, leaving nothing but the endless ocean stretching in all directions under a dark and empty sky. And there, in the darkness and the silence that followed, it would seem that everything had ended, that Ragnarok had brought not just the death of the gods, but the annihilation of all existence. Some scholars suggest the original Norse vision may have ended here with total destruction. and no rebirth. However, the sources that survive speak of something more. Hints that this ending might not be absolute, that from the ashes of the old world, something new might grow. For even as the world sank beneath the waves, even as the fires died and the steam dissipated, few beings would survive. Deep within Yggdrasil, in the safest part of the tree, two humans would hide, sheltered from the flames and the flood. Their names would be Lif and Lifthrashir, which mean life and eager for life, and they would represent the continuation of humanity, the seed from which a new race of mortals would spring. They would survive by drinking the morning dew that collected on the tree's bark, would sustain themselves on this simple nourishment while the world died around them. When the fires had cooled and the waters had receded, when the air was once again safe to breathe, they would emerge from their shelter and look upon a new world, green and beautiful, rising from the ocean. This new earth would be more fertile than the old one, blessed with an abundance that the previous world had never known. Fields would yield crops without needing to be planted. Fruit trees would grow without needing to be tended. And the air and water would be pure and clean. Leaf and Lifthrashir would wander through this paradise, would find it rich with possibilities, and they would begin the work of repopulating the world, becoming the ancestors of a new human race. Some of the gods would also survive. Vidar and Vali, Odin's sons, would live through Ragnarok, as would Modi and Magni, Thor's sons. These young gods would inherit Mjolnir from their father, would carry on his legacy of protection and strength. They would gather in the place where Asgard once stood, in a field called Idavol, and there they would sit and talk about the old world, remembering the gods who had fallen, discussing the events that had led to Ragnarok, perhaps wondering if things could have gone differently. Balder would return from Helheim, released at last from Hel's realm, now that the old cosmic order had been destroyed. With him would come Hod, his brother and killer, and these two would be reconciled in the new world, their ancient tragedy forgiven and forgotten. Honir, another god who had survived, would join them, bringing with him the ability to read omens and divine the future, gifts that would serve the new age well. These surviving gods would find two golden chess pieces in the grass where Asgard had stood, artifacts from the old world that had somehow survived the conflagration. They would remember the games the Aesir had played in the golden age before Balder's death, before the signs of Ragnarok had begun to appear. These chess pieces would serve as a connection to the past, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of the joy and fellowship that had existed before the end. A new sun would appear in the sky, the daughter of the old sun, born before her mother was devoured by Skull. This new sun would shine brighter and warmer than the old one had, would travel her mother's path across the sky, but without fear of the wolf who had chased the original sun since the world's beginning. A new moon would follow a similar path, and the stars would be replaced, creating a sky that was familiar yet different from what had come before. The sources then speak of a new and mighty ruler who would come from above, one greater than any who had come before, who would judge the living and the dead and establish a reign of justice and peace. Scholars often point to this figure as evidence of Christian influence creeping into the recorded mythology, since these descriptions echo Christian apocalyptic literature. Whether this represents an authentic pre-Christian Norse concept or a later addition remains one of the enduring debates in the study of these myths. Regardless of which elements were original and which may have been later additions, the essential message captured in these stories remained powerful. The world would end, but it would also begin again. Death would lead to rebirth, destruction would make way for renewal, and the cycle would continue. This was the Norse understanding of time, not as a straight line leading from past to future, but as a great wheel that turned eternally, bringing endings that were also beginnings. The story of Norse mythology, from the void of Ginnungagap to the fires of Ragnarok and the world that would grow after, was more than just entertaining tales told around winter fires. It was a comprehensive worldview, a way of understanding existence and humanity's place within it. The Norse saw a universe where order and chaos were locked in eternal struggle, where the gods themselves were not all-powerful, but were subject to fate, where death was inevitable, but honor could make it meaningful. The gods of Norse mythology were not distant, perfect beings, but flawed individuals who made mistakes, who felt fear and doubt, who struggled with moral choices just as humans did. Odin sacrificed his eye for wisdom, hung himself from a tree for knowledge, yet still could not prevent Ragnarok. Thor fought valiantly against the giants, protecting Midgard with all his strength, yet he too would fall in the final battle. Even the beloved Balder, most pure of all the gods, died through treachery, and his death could not be undone despite all efforts to save him. This acceptance of fate, this acknowledgement that even the gods could not escape their destiny, was central to Norse thought. It created a worldview that valued courage in the face of inevitable defeat, that praised those who fought on even when they knew victory was impossible. The Einherjar trained every day for a battle they knew they would lose, and they did so joyfully, considering it an honor to die in service to the gods. The gods themselves prepared for Ragnarok knowing it would destroy them, yet they faced it with open eyes and brave hearts. The preservation of these myths through the centuries, recorded by Christian scholars in Iceland long after the Viking Age had ended, has given us a window into this unique worldview. The Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, and the Poetic Edda, compiled around the same time from older sources, contain the bulk of what we know about Norse mythology. These texts were written down centuries after the myths had taken their final form, and they were recorded by people who no longer believed in the old gods, yet they preserved something essential about the Norse understanding of the world. Modern audiences continue to find these stories compelling, continue to return to the myths of Odin and Thor, Loki and Balder, the World Tree and Ragnarok. Perhaps it is because these myths speak to fundamental human experiences, the search for meaning in a chaotic world, the need to find purpose in the face of mortality, the desire to act with courage even when the odds seem insurmountable. The Norse gods, with all their flaws and struggles, remain resonant because they face challenges that we ourselves face, writ large on a cosmic scale. The mythology also provides rich material for understanding the culture that created it. The emphasis on honor, on reputation, on dying well rather than living as a coward. These values shaped Viking Age society and can be seen reflected in the myths. The complex relationship between gods and giants, with frequent intermarriage and occasional cooperation despite their fundamental opposition, reflects the reality of a society where feuds and alliances were constantly shifting, where yesterday's enemy might be tomorrow's in-law. The role of fate in Norse mythology deserves special attention. The Norns, those three sisters who wove the threads of destiny at the base of Yggdrasil, were more powerful than the gods themselves. Not even Odin could change the fate they had decreed. This belief in an immutable destiny might seem fatalistic to modern minds, but for the Norse it created a framework for understanding tragedy and finding meaning in loss. If one's fate was already determined, then the measure of a person lay not in avoiding death, but in facing it well, in dying with courage and honor intact. This understanding of fate also explained why the gods, despite their power, could not prevent Ragnarok. They knew it was coming, had known since the beginning that their reign would end in fire and destruction, yet they could not change this destiny. All they could do was face it with courage, to fight, even knowing they would fall, to make their last stand worthy of memory. And in the Norse worldview, memory was everything. To be remembered after death, to have one's deeds spoken of by future generations. This was the only immortality available to mortals, and even the gods sought it. The trickster figure of Loki deserves special consideration, for he embodies many of the complexities and contradictions that make Norse mythology so rich. Loki was neither fully good nor fully evil, neither completely trustworthy nor entirely malevolent. He helped the gods on many occasions, using his cunning to get them out of difficult situations, yet he also caused enormous harm, culminating in his role in Baldur's death. His punishment, bound in a cave with poison dripping on his face, was terrible but also poignant, especially in light of his wife Sigin's loyalty. Loki's children, those monstrous beings who would play such crucial roles in Ragnarok, reflect his nature as a creature of chaos and transformation. Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the serpent, Hel the half-dead goddess, and Sleipnir the eight-legged horse. All of these beings came from Loki's various unions, and all of them were threats or tools that the gods attempted to control or contain. The binding of Fenrir, the casting of Jormungandr into the ocean, the relegation of Hel to the underworld. These actions were motivated by fear, by the gods' recognition that Loki's offspring represented forces they could not fully control. Yet these attempts at containment ultimately failed, for at Ragnarok, all of these bound forces would break free and join in the destruction of the world. This suggests a worldview in which chaos cannot be permanently suppressed, in which the forces that threaten order will eventually have their day, in which destruction and renewal are part of an endless cycle. The gods' efforts to maintain cosmic order were valiant and necessary, but they were also ultimately temporary, holding back chaos for a time, but unable to prevent its eventual triumph. The world tree Yggdrasil stands as perhaps the most powerful symbol in all of Norse mythology, representing the interconnected nature of existence, the way that all the 9 worlds were bound together into a single cosmic structure. The tree was constantly under threat from Nidhogg gnawing at its roots, the stags browsing on its branches, yet it endured, sustained by the Norns' care and by its own innate vitality. This image of a tree that connects all things, that holds together the entire cosmos, despite constant assault, speaks to a deep understanding of how fragile and precious the cosmic order actually is. The three wells at the base of Yggdrasil's roots: the well of Urd, where the Norns dwelt, the well of Mimir that held wisdom, and the spring Vergelmir, from which all rivers flowed. These represented different sources of power and knowledge that sustained the cosmos. The gods drew on these wells for guidance and strength, yet they could not control them completely. Even Odin, with all his wisdom, had to sacrifice his eye to drink from Mimir's well, had to pay a terrible price for the knowledge he sought. This theme of sacrifice for knowledge appears repeatedly in Norse mythology. Odin's sacrifice of his eye, his hanging on Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to learn the runes, Tyr's sacrifice of his hand to bind Fenrir. These acts demonstrated that worthwhile things required sacrifice, that knowledge and power came at a cost. The gods were willing to mutilate themselves, to endure suffering, to give up things they valued to achieve their goals. This created a view of the divine that was far removed from the omnipotent, perfect gods of some other mythological systems. The relationship between gods and humans in Norse mythology was also distinctive. The gods needed human worship and sacrifice, needed the prayers and offerings that mortals provided, while humans needed the gods' protection and blessing. There was a reciprocal relationship rather than a simple hierarchy of worship. The gods were invested in human survival, not just out of benevolence, but out of practical necessity. When humans built temples and made sacrifices, when they honored the gods through their actions and remembered them in their stories, they helped sustain the divine order. This is perhaps why Odin gathered the Einherjar, why he needed an army of dead warriors to fight at Ragnarok. The gods could not win the final battle alone. They needed mortal aid, needed the warriors who had proven their courage and skill in life to continue serving in death. The Valkyries who rode across battlefields to select the slain were not just collecting soldiers, they were honoring those mortals who had lived according to the values that the gods cherished. The concept of Valhalla, that great hall where warriors fought all day and feasted all night, where death in combat was followed by resurrection for the evening's celebration, represented an idealized afterlife for a warrior culture. But it was not the only afterlife available in Norse belief. Freya received half of the battle slain in her hall Sessrumnir, while those who died of sickness or old age went to Hell's realm. This multiplicity of afterlives reflected a nuanced understanding of death, an acknowledgement that different kinds of death might lead to different destinations. The Norse pantheon included not just the Aesir, but also the Vanir, those gods of fertility and prosperity who had once been at war with the Aesir before joining them through the exchange of hostages. This war between the two tribes of gods may have reflected actual historical conflicts between different groups of worshippers, between a warrior culture that honored the Aesir and an agricultural culture that honored the Vanir. The eventual peace and integration of the two pantheons suggested that both approaches were valid, that both war and peace, both agriculture and combat, had their place in a functioning society. The Vanir brought their own gifts to the combined pantheon, particularly their mastery of cedar, a form of magic that involved prophecy and shape-shifting. Freya taught this magic to Odin, demonstrating that even the All-Father had things to learn from others, that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. This magic was associated with women more than men in Norse society, and there was something considered unmanning about it, yet Odin practiced it anyway, willing to endure social disapproval in his quest for knowledge and power. The giants of Jotunheim, though often portrayed as enemies of the gods, were not simple villains. Many of them possessed wisdom that surpassed even the gods, and the gods often married giantesses or formed alliances with giants when it suited their purposes. Thor's mother was a giantess, Odin's mother was a giantess, and many other gods had giant ancestry. This intermingling suggested that the boundary between order and chaos was not absolute, that the giants represented not evil, but rather a different way of being, a connection to raw nature and primal forces that the gods had moved beyond, but could not entirely escape. The story of the gods building the wall around Asgard provides an interesting example of this complex relationship. A giant offered to build a wall that would protect Asgard from all threats, asking only for the sun, the moon, and Freya as payment. The gods, thinking the task impossible, agreed to his terms. But the giant had a magnificent stallion that made the work progress far faster than expected, and it became clear that he might actually complete the wall within the agreed time frame. Rather than honor their agreement, the gods sent Loki to distract the stallion, causing the work to fall behind schedule. When the giant became enraged at this trickery, Thor killed him with Mjolnir. This story shows the gods at their most pragmatic and least honorable, breaking oaths, using deception, resorting to violence when their schemes were discovered. It demonstrates that the Norse gods were not moral exemplars, but complex beings who did what they thought necessary to protect their interests, even when their actions violated the codes of honor they claimed to uphold. The wall itself ended up incomplete, forever missing one stone, a permanent reminder of the gods' deception. Yet from this episode came Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, for Loki had transformed himself into a mare to distract the giant stallion and had given birth to the foal as a result. This pattern of good emerging from bad, of unexpected benefits arising from seemingly disastrous situations, appears throughout Norse mythology. The dwarf forged treasures that the gods possessed, including Thor's hammer Mjolnir, came about because Loki had caused a problem that required fixing. The gods' wisdom often grew through adversity and suffering, rather than through peaceful contemplation. The dwarves themselves were fascinating figures in Norse mythology, master craftsmen whose skill surpassed all others, yet whose origins as maggots feeding on Ymir's corpse gave them a grotesque quality. They lived underground in great halls, carved from stone, and would turn to stone themselves if exposed to sunlight. Despite these limitations, they created wonders. Ships that could be folded up and carried in a pocket, spears that never missed, hammers that always returned to the thrower, golden hair that grew like real hair. These creations demonstrated that even beings of lowly origin could achieve greatness through skill and dedication. The light elves and dark elves represented different aspects of the supernatural realm, with the light elves associated with beauty and growth, the dark elves associated with death and the underworld. Yet the distinction between dark elves and dwarves was often unclear in the sources, suggesting that Norse cosmology was not as rigidly categorized as later scholars sometimes tried to make it. The realms themselves overlapped. Boundaries were permeable, and beings could move between worlds in ways that defied simple spatial logic. This flexibility, this resistance to rigid categorization, may be one of the most appealing aspects of Norse mythology for modern audiences. The cosmos it describes is messy and complicated, full of contradictions and ambiguities, much like our own experience of reality. The gods are powerful but limited, wise but flawed, honorable but capable of deception. The giants are enemies but also relatives, threats but also sources of wisdom. The worlds themselves are distinct yet interconnected, separate yet bound together by the world tree. The prophecy of Ragnarok, with its vision of destruction followed by renewal, provided a framework for understanding change and loss. For a culture that knew the harsh realities of survival in Scandinavia, where winters could kill and crop failures could lead to starvation, the idea that destruction was not the end, but rather a necessary precursor to rebirth had deep resonance. The world would end, yes, but it would also begin again, green and beautiful, ready for a new age. This cyclical view of time, this understanding that endings were also beginnings, stands in contrast to the linear view of time that dominates much of Western thought. For the Norse, history did not progress steadily towards some final goal, but rather moved in cycles, repeating patterns that had occurred before and would occur again. The new sun would follow the path of the old sun. The surviving gods would rebuild on the site where Asgard had stood, and Lif and Lifthraisir would repopulate the world, just as Ask and Embla had done in the distant past. Yet each cycle was not mere repetition, but contained the possibility of improvement. The new world would be more fertile than the old. The new sun would shine brighter, and perhaps the new race of gods and humans would avoid the mistakes of their predecessors. This suggested that while the pattern might repeat, the outcome could be different, that there was hope for growth and improvement, even within a cyclical understanding of time. The influence of Norse mythology extends far beyond the culture that created it. The days of our week bear the names of Norse gods. Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Woden, Thursday for Thor, and Friday for Frigg or Freya. These linguistic remnants remind us that Norse beliefs once held sway over much of Northern Europe, shaping the way people understood the world and their place in it. In modern times, Norse mythology has experienced a remarkable revival of interest. From Richard Wagner's Ring cycle to Marvel's Thor films, from J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth to video games like God of War, the gods and stories of Norse mythology continue to inspire new creative works. This enduring appeal speaks to something fundamental in these tales, some essential truth about courage, fate, sacrifice, and renewal that transcends their original cultural context. As we come to the end of this journey through Norse mythology, from the void of Ginnungagap to the fires of Ragnarok, from the creation of the first beings to the rebirth of the world, we see a mythology that is both ancient and eternally relevant. These stories speak to fundamental human concerns. How do we find meaning in a world we cannot fully control? How do we face death with courage? How do we balance order and chaos, structure and freedom, duty and desire? The Norse gods, with all their power and all their flaws, modeled a way of being that valued courage over safety, honor over survival, action over passivity. They knew their fate, but fought against it anyway. They understood that they would fall, but prepared for battle nonetheless. They saw the end approaching, but did not let that knowledge paralyze them or prevent them from living fully in the present. This mythology reminds us that endings are inevitable, but not meaningless, that destruction clears the way for renewal, that winter always gives way to spring. The world tree may shake and the stars may fall, the seas may rise and the fires may consume all, but from the ashes and the flood, new life will emerge. The cycle will continue, the wheel will turn, and the story will begin again. If you enjoyed this journey through the complete story of Norse mythology, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the myths and legends that have shaped human culture. Until next time, may you face your own challenges with the courage of Thor, the wisdom of Odin, and the hope for renewal that lies at the heart of Ragnarok.